Good morning. This is Edwin on the subject of healthy soils and how to maintain it on Friday, the 3rd of May. Thank you for being on the call, everyone. I would like to say this, that I enjoy thinking about what I'm about to share. I have to say that I'm very excited about this. It's kind of a reflective mode that this has put me in when I started studying about what am I going to share. And so this time I'm going to do it a little bit differently because of what I came from my reflection this morning. I would like to give you just a little bit of history. I have often done this, but it bears repeating. So in 1984, in January, I had started working for my father-in-law, and it wasn't but a couple weeks later he said, "Edwin, there's a new way to farm. It's called renewable farming." Now, a side note to that is it's called regenerative farming today for no doubt the right reasons, even though my favorite term is renewable. But anyway, and I said, "What is that? And what is renewable farming?" And he said, "Well, for every set of 5 years that you farm, your farm is more productive with less inputs. Your farm is better able to support the plant life and interact with the sun. You're better able to have higher yields and more profitable yields than you had before." Now, that all sounded good to me because I had just come away from a very dire situation a few years earlier where we were caught with too high of an interest debt load with a high interest of 21.5%. So I can tell you that this felt like an answer to prayer because I was praying, "God, if there's a way for me to help farmers thrive in my life's work, let me be in it." And maybe I should relate the story of Thomas Blackwell saying, "Be careful of what you wish for because you might get it." In his mind, what you speak about, you bring about. And certainly that was what happened with me. And so if we look at this factor of where I came from, absolutely 100% green, just knowing I knew how soil smelled, I knew how good soil felt, I knew how cloddy soil felt, I knew how hard soil felt. I had been farming with my dad as a little boy all the way up from when I was 4 years old to up to that point. So I knew something about soils. As a matter of fact, I thought I knew a lot about soils. And while I knew a lot and had been around it all my life, I figured out soon that I didn't know hardly anything about soils. It is so amazing. This topic could be 10 hours long without stopping if I would just put together an outline and do it. There is way more topic here than I can do for the next half an hour to 40 minutes. I do want to have a balance of interaction and topics, so I won't go that long for now. I'm just going to pick a piece of it, and then it'll branch out as we get into the interaction side. But as I mentioned in our email going out, soil is a medium in which the energy of the sun and atmospheric air can be received and brought into and delivered to plants. Now, going back to my story from the historical context, I did not realize at that time what a tremendous amount of truth that really is. If you look at where we're coming from and what that really is doing, it's so important for us to gather what really is soil. As a farmer, I have a tendency, because I'm in the forest and cannot see the trees, I have a tendency to use my soil to get my profitability for this year. As a matter of fact, if I don't have profitability this year, I might not be around eventually. It just depends how deep my pockets are. But eventually you go out of business in anything once you have enough losses. Either you're wise enough to change something or get out or do whatever. So at the end of the day, the soil is potentially something I want to get something out of. And as I was driving down the road this morning, I glanced out into the fields, and here was a field where it was beautiful. It was nice texture. It was soft. You could tell it was working well. And then all of a sudden I thought about this and I looked at it. And then I got to another area of the same exact field. And there were clods about, I don't know, 2 to 3 inches in diameter, some 4 inches in diameter. And it just looked rough. You could tell that the guy worked it too wet. And so when you looked at it, the same field, some of it was treated wonderfully, and some of the field was treated horribly. Not making a negative connotation on the farmer one bit. The guy is a very good farmer. As a matter of fact, it's only using it as an example for my point. When you think about it, soil can become hard, tightly compacted magnetically. It can be simply compacted because of actual compaction or working the soil when it's too wet. Well, the reason that doesn't work well in the spring especially, it's different in the fall, but in the spring especially, the reason that doesn't work well is the soils are cooler, and that does not allow for it to be as resilient and ease up on its compaction. So when it's cold and it's too wet and we work it, we drag soil particles together. It's not just driving over it, it's dragging soil particles tighter together. And as they come tightly together, they weld together, so to speak. This is a metaphoric phrase, but it is a phrase that kind of describes the fact that soil become cloddy. And I give you all of these examples to start in with my topic. My topic is really important from this standpoint. Soil is something that needs to be served. I like how my friend out of Georgia, Gerald Keller, says it. He put together a presentation that I kind of pondered on many times, and I really, really like it. And that phrase is about looking at soil that serves. If you look at it from a scriptural point of view, and this is, it really impressed me, is what's amazing to me when I thought about it, he talks about abad in Hebrew language in the Old Testament, going all the way back in Genesis. In King James it says to till the land. In Hebrew it's abad, and the abad is to serve the land. And that's really actually kind of to think about, serving the land. If you stop and think about it, the farmer that serves his soil, if he serves his soil correctly, his soil serves his needs, not the other way around. To me, that's a very important distinction. And so when I talk about this topic, I'm really turning it into serving the soil so that it serves the people. And if you look at it, I'm going to just give you a few scriptures that makes it tilleth, abad in Hebrew, to work, to serve, to till. Those are 3 different descriptions. I'm going to choose the word to serve. And in Genesis 2, verse 5, there was not a man to till the ground, it says, but we would put that in the context to serve, because it's also the word abad. And then the Lord God took man and put him into the garden to serve it and to keep it. And if you look at this garden, to serve it and keep it, we have something that we have to take and put into context. And that is, from my perspective, God all the way back in the 2nd chapter, and this is in verse 15, and the Lord God took man and put him into the garden to till it and keep it in King James, but I would like to say to serve it and keep it. And the reason that God set that in order is that we as people need to serve the soil. so that it serves us. Ecclesiastes 5:9 says, moreover, the profit of the earth is for all. The king himself is, quote, served by the field. And again, this is the word abad in Hebrew. So go to Proverbs. He that serveth, and remember, I'm talking tilleth versus serveth. The context of tilleth being service, his shall have plenty of bread. But he that followeth after vain persons shall have poverty enough. He that serveth his land shall be satisfied with bread, but he that followeth vain persons is void of understanding. So it's so interesting in the context of Scripture how this word serve comes out. And this is basically my message today, is if we want to have soil that serves us, we really do need to understand that we need to serve the soil first. I recognize what I am talking about needs to be put into proper perspective, proper context. We do not have a choice. We need to be profitable each year. And so really the goal is to properly serve the soil, and in top with that, in conjunction with serving the soil, we need to also serve our plants. And this is what I'm so excited about, is serving the plants in a proper manner. I want you to know that if we are ready and able to be taken this serious to serve the soil so it can serve us, and we keep that in our focus, then if we serve the plants and serve the soil together, we have a much more productive, profitable year. And so if I look at that, healthy soil, which is the topic of this morning, and how to maintain it, is we had to serve it to the extent it became healthy. And one way to not serve it, sometimes I think that a good way to not serve the soil is a way to help understand how to serve it. One way to not serve it is to simply focus on, well, it's time to plant. I'm going to go out there and I'm going to get this thing worked up because it needs to be brought under control. And that brings a point up. We think we have to be in control of our soil. Well, it just depends on our attitude. Do we want our soil to ultimately do what we want for our long-term future? Is that what we want? In that context, that's great. But if we just want to have something short-term right now, we've often sacrificed the future for the present. And I am not an advocate of that. I am an advocate that we do need to stay in business. And for those farmers that are either going to be in business next year, if they make a profit and it comes down to that crisis, I beg you to do two things. Number one, make sure you get a consultant to walk beside you, because you are emotionally so attached to the fact that you want to be farming next year that I can tell you, based on personal experience, that it is very apt that you will make choices that just takes away and does not deposit. It is so similar to a bank account. If we put money into our bank account, we can withdraw. But by just withdrawing and not putting in, which is what the tendency is when the rubber hits the road and you're up against the wall financially, the tendency is that you will make some choices that not only are poor for you short term, but devastating for you long term. And what you want, if you're in trouble, is you want to get out of trouble. And so that has to have a delicate balance of short-term, long-term views. That's why I'm a strong advocate to not be without someone walking beside you. No man is an island. This idea of a self-made man, And I know it's an image that was made in the culture of America today, but I'm going to simply say it this way. We need to learn interdependence, not dependence. The difference is simple. We do and want to work with whomever we want to, and I can talk about relationships, but let's put that in the context of soil. We want to give and take with the soil properly. If we work our soils too wet, we are not serving it. If we wait too long to work our soils and we had cover crops and then our crops don't do well because we had the wrong timing, well, maybe we should have mowed it. Maybe we should have raked the soil with a lightweight rake and a light tractor just to break surface contact so that we can dry out the soil in the extreme cases. Maybe we have to make some compromises that gets us to the goal so we can then serve the soil properly. I have done all of those things. I have worked soils too wet. I have gone in there with a light rake in desperation of, hey, I know it's too wet, but I took a very lightweight 40 horsepower tractor over the field with a very lightweight rake, and within 2 or 3 hours we were able to till that soil properly, and it was not too wet, and we had very good yields, and the soil responded healthily. There are so many different things. The beauty of farming is that we get to make a lot of choices. Some of them bite us in the future. Some of them help us in the future. My job today is to get us to look at it from a position of strength, from a position of getting us more healthy financially, from a position of getting this to happen in such a manner that we can make it all happen in a beneficial way for us long term and not lose sight of our short-term needs. I hope I'm coming across that the fact that to restore soils to healthy soils is the same exact topic of how to maintain it. If you want to improve the health of your soils, you now know how to maintain the health of your soils. And I'm going to start in by starting out from a big picture context. Assuming annual crops, it is very similar to perennial, and I'll talk about perennial and what differences there are. But I want to talk about annual crops to start with. If we start with knowing our plans always should consist of having a harvest that is spaced before dormancy of the soil, then we can deal with improving our soils. If we have late harvests, we're already planning to run behind the 8-ball. If we look at a 10-year profit margin perspective and look at how we optimize our profits in 10 years, one thing we will not do is not more than once out of that 10 years will we harvest late. I want to make that a very blunt statement. It starts there. First and foremost, harvesting late kills your profits long term. Just will. You have to have a restoration period after harvest while the soil is warm enough to take care of. So you can have some cover crops potentially, and even if you wouldn't be, so that you can have a restoration of decomposing your residues with warm temperatures. Bottom line is, we got to take care of our soil so it takes care of us. It starts with the early harvest. That's number one. We cannot, if we do a late harvest, then we come into the spring and the soil is really telling us without speaking up loudly, saying, hang on a moment, I need to restore back what I couldn't restore last fall because you kept me working all the way up until dormancy. I got to have some restoration time. Well, then that translates to late planting, et cetera, and poor soil kills or structured soils or bad, et cetera. So again, part of the way to get structured soil, part of the way to have the highest amount of profits year after year is to start with early harvest. The second piece that I want to talk about is we got to have soil samples so we can understand where we're going, and we got to have those reports. I make a very unpopular suggestion at every soils class I train, and I'm about to do it now. And that is get somebody grunting out in your fields when you barely can walk them in the August time frame and get those samples put back into the lab and the reports back before harvest so that you know what you want to do right after harvest. Don't wait until harvest to take your soil samples. That would be my highest recommendation. I am very unpopular when I say that because who wants to do that? I have at one point in my career, towards the last of the 80s and the early 90s, I made a living out of not just this, but one of the same ways I made my living was to go do soil samples for people. And that's the way we did it. I wanted to do it, and the farmers loved it because now they had something to go by before they got into the fall. Excuse me. And so now we're going to go to the third point. Utilize soil balancing principles as your choice of how to further your goals. You have a way of operating soils that is twofold, and they are on a track together. On the one side, we are looking at balancing the soils so that we can get the base saturations in a balanced form. This is very, very critical for long-term future health of your soil. And the second piece, along the same track, along that same line, is to look at what you want to do is you want to make sure that you feed your crop at the same time you're balancing your soils. We cannot forget the fact that we have to do that. I would like to get the soils to the place where it is 90% able to feed the crop of itself because of how you served your soils, and 10% called a stimulation, a guidance, a tweaking, a taking it to the upper end level is what you want to end up doing with your soil. This is the ideal balance, in my opinion. Can I say 90 to 10 or 80 to 20? I don't know what's exactly there, but you get the idea. Your biggest focus should be get to serve your soil. It will then serve your plants. And that is such a healthy balance of profitability for your 10-year profit margins. I want to say one more time, I've often told this story, but I repeat it, and that is, in the successful farmer or progressive farmer, I do not recall, there was a 10-year study that was done over a group of farmers. And they categorized farmers into two categories. And in each category, they tried to have the equal amount of farmers that are in one category versus the other. So category one was those farmers that were very short-term minded. They said, well, all I care about is that I last another year. And they really did not plan forward. They didn't plan forward in terms of their cropping programs in the next 5 years, subject, of course, to change. But if you have a plan like that, you end up having a much better end result. So they were not long-term planners. The second group was long-term planners. And so what they tried to do is they put them in each category. So livestock grain farmers, they put in one category. And then they had farmers on both sides of the fence, short-term versus long. Then they had strictly grain farmers. Again, short-term versus long. Then they had strictly livestock farmers who didn't have much land. Again, short-term versus long. And they had almost 900 people in this test that they did this study. And at the end of 10 years, the long-term thinking people who virtually had the same crop rotation plans, they tried to be sure it was apples with apples. The long-term people had 33% more income at the end of 10 years. That's significant, especially in the context of less than 7 years down the road, The long-term thinkers already had the income the short-term thinkers were going to have at the end of 10 years. So that really is outstanding, because at the end of 10 years, the long-term thinkers are just ahead by quite a bit. And so it is a fairly significant deal. It's called leverage when you are a long-term planner. And so this is such an important factor to bring into this topic as you serve your soil. So the next step that I would like to talk about is in the springtime. Never, ever work your soil too wet. Again, I mentioned about having the ability to scratch your soil surface if that's what is needed, just so that your squishing together of soil particles doesn't happen when you work your soils. Yes, I can hear some people say, well, I strip till, and that's good. I understand that. But again, even strip tillers, they know that if it wasn't strip tilled the fall before, it probably isn't serving the soil well in the spring. Or some others talk about no-till as kind of the holy grail. Well, I'm of the opinion, based on experience, that in some cases no-till is an extremely valuable, in fact, the most important factor that they have in their equation. But I cannot talk about no-till being across the board the best approach. I cannot say that. I have too much experience either way to say that. And so even in a no-till, if you do not set yourself up with a early harvest so that you can end up having a good decomposition cycle in the fall, your soil structure is actually going to get worse, not better. So in the end, these principles absolutely apply. Don't want to work soils cold and wet. That just sets you up for a struggle the rest of the year. Weeds, soil structure, you got to put on more fertilizer in order to survive and make the yields that you got to use. The profits go down. Again, it takes away from my 10-year picture. So in the spring, if we take care of our soil, we are going to plant when it's time to plant. One of the confessions I'll make on our personal operation, I don't farm much right now, but on our personal operation, we were not always ready with our equipment to plant in time. And I would have to say that that's probably a downfall that we've had. And I want to encourage to people to say humbly, look, we've got to have our equipment ready. The most successful farmers are there when it's fit, and they're not there, and everything is ready to go, and it's just going seamlessly without much breakdowns. Those are the things that really make a difference in the end. I would like to just comment about one factor, and that is preventative maintenance is something like this. It's been said an ounce of prevention is worth a ton of cure. No, I didn't say a pound of cure. I said a ton of cure. And so it is really truly that we want to prepare for success. Because once it is time, that's one thing the farmer has. He works with the elements, the weather, and in that context, he really has some challenges. The challenges is that he's ready at the moment of the right time, and then he does what he needs to do on time. If I could bottle that up and sell it, it would make so many farmers so much money right there. And so management comes into play, as this is what I call management. This comes into play as the very next piece of being successful in farming and having a healthy soil and maintain healthy soils. And yet, I want to step back a little bit, and I want to put this into a little bit of a summation. If you look at it, all of that, maybe I should first say something, I apologize, but I skipped one piece, and that is we have to have good stands. Our seed-to-soil contact, our moisture, management of seed-to-soil contact, all of that is very crucial. And one more piece to this. If I now switch gears a little bit to perennial crops and then summarize it all, the perennial crops, I could spend an entire TeleClass and likely should, but in the context of managing soils to be healthy and maintaining it, the perennial crops is looking at is serving your soil and especially feeding your soil just before what I call ovulation period. That is that time frame between the July-August time frame. Just prior to that, you need to be really critical of how you can serve your soil because that is your long-term approach. Again, decomposition principles apply. Working soils too wet applies in this context. But in managing perennial crops, always remember the three things. Ovulation period needs to be top of your list. Bud set needs to be your next set, and then fruit fill. If you are in fruit bearing trees, nut trees, whatever it is, that is then last. The other aspect, if you have that, you want to manage your crops in this way, both perennial and annual, and that is keep your sap flowing without restriction. And what I mean by that is we cannot have fertilizers that detract from having the sap flow well. So how do we deal with that? Okay. If we get ourselves in a situation where we have an abundance of nitrogen, since nitrogen is an electrolyte, since nitrogen wants to be attracted into the soil, into the plants, it displaces getting anything else and guarantees an imbalance, growth. And if I think about growth, remember, one cell grows and then another. And in the process of growing a cell, it brings in the original ingredients first, and after that, it brings in all the other interactions depending on where that cell is. It goes different paths of its growing, but eventually the cell wall is formed, the ingredients are captured inside the cell, and if you have a balanced form of nutrition, the cell wall is solid, the cell wall has no leaky parts to it, the cell wall is full of integrity, there's not an excess amount of moisture in there, and thus it flows well. That keeps the sap flowing well. An example is if you dig plants, especially for trees or any other type of perennials, asparagus, I really don't care, alfalfa, etc. If you look at splitting the plant apart, you'll see that in the xylem phloem area, which is the entryway up in the air between the soil root zone and on top of the soil, right in that area, there often is a gummosis forming. You got to keep that from happening. Now, is there enough time today to how to keep that happening? No, but I want to give the high level of this. When you have abundance of anything, that's even more critical, by the way, than the absence of something or a deficiency, because often a deficiency, by the way, is caused by an excess of something else. If we can just keep our excesses down, you'll have a tremendous amount more ability to take and bring up the amount of nutrients in that cell much easier, and it will be in a balanced form with a solid cell wall, and now all of a sudden sap flows with 1/2 to 75% to 90% less energy required. Well, automatically that means more yield and higher quality, longer shelf life. Next week we'll be talking about shelf life in heirloom tomatoes. Heirloom tomatoes are extremely dependent on tight, balanced nutrition to have good shelf life. It is very dramatically different. And so if you look at it from that perspective, we got to serve the soil and serve our production. So in summation, when we look at this in context, the soil isn't just there to be an anchor for a plant. The soil is a medium in which the energy of the sun and the atmospheric air can be received and brought into and delivered to plants. This is designed to serve plants for optimum production if the soil is first served well. I have this in my email out there, but I think it bears repeating. I think this is so powerful. There should be a lively interaction between soil particles, the small, tiny soil particles, the minerals, the decaying organic matter, the living organisms, and plant roots. And I call it a marriage between plant roots and soil, and the water and air moving in and around the soil, and well-structured soil allows the microorganisms to deliver the nutrients that are needed. So if you look at it, in order to be that healthy, lively soil, you have to have a structured soil. That is step one, or it says it this way, you've got to surmount that bar. You have to have well-structured soils. And by having that, you will have a lot of other things go well for you. You have got to understand you have a big part in keeping your soil structured better. This keeps the soil from eroding, both water erosion, air and wind erosion, and this also keeps the soils healthy where the plants do not attract the insects or diseases, etc., etc. And so I will just deviate one last piece to bring this into context. I ended up going over to Europe because I found out in my journey of being trained in renewable farming science, which, by the way, took 7.5 years to graduate using 4 different mentors, and they did it the experiential way. I've said this many times, but I'll just bear repeating, and that is I had to take and study something, and then I have to prove that I got it by making it happen in the field. Only then could I advance my studies. Well, by the time I graduated, I knew soils. And in the end of that, I heard of this gentleman over in Europe that had studied the soil well enough. He knew that there was over 4,000 beneficial enzymes required by plants coming out of soils. And I said, what? Look, I've just done some studies with enzymes in greenhouses, and I discovered how I can make fertilizers way more effective, have more yields with less cost. So I said, we got to find out more about this. And we ended up going to Europe. And as I walked on his field, this gentleman that had that, I was able to dig down to my elbow with no restriction, just using my hands. It was sugar granular type of structured soil, beautiful soil. And what's amazing is I crossed the fence that used to be the same farm 20 years earlier, and 2 farmers bought the place, so they split the farm in half. And what used to be in the same field, I went across the fence 30 feet, I couldn't get even 2 to 3 inches, and it was tight soil. That's all I could do with my hands. This digging down into the soil to my elbow without any restriction, having beautiful structure, not too loose soils, but beautiful structure, just that image is indelible in my mind. I cannot get rid of it. Guys, we have a wonderful future of having a healthy soil and maintaining it because, believe me, it does a very good job of serving farmers. Beyond that, on the top of that whole entire goal, now we are producing food that increases the health of the people that consume it. And that, by the way, brings a passion to my life that I cannot express adequately enough. And that is the ability for us to be all involved in improving the health and the lives of others. There isn't a single farmer out there that cannot be joining that group of farmers to increase. And I invite you to increase that group of people that ends up increasing the health of the soils to increase the health of the plants and their profits. It's an and world, not an either-or world. And with that, I'd like to open it up for interaction. I apologize to not have enough time for interaction, perhaps, but let's give it a go.
This is Matthew Yoder, Gary Mills, Illinois. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, so I have several questions. To the point that only 1 year out of 10 should a farmer be allowed to harvest late. So you mentioned you've got to have a proper decomposition cycle at the end of harvest. so I'm sure that's one reason for not having a late harvest. Another thing that comes to mind is being able to get a cover crop out. Is there more to the picture, and also the decomposition piece I would like to understand a little better?
I'm not sure if I lost you guys. Am I back here? I'm not sure what happened.
We can hear you, Edmund.
So my response was not heard. I apologize that. It's something that I thought I was being heard and I wasn't. So my answer was the reason that I mentioned 1 year out of 10 that we end up being able to get by with a late harvest is, in practicality, as you can do it, there's a give and take in your soil. I think you can get by with it. But I would encourage everyone to never plan on that. In other words, there are years where it starts raining before your crop is finished ripening or maturing, where it goes for several weeks up to a month of just no opportunity to harvest. And I think there's enough forgiveness in the system where those years you can probably get by with it. And yes, in practicality, things run in cycles, and that could be even 2 or 3 years in a row. I understand. But try to plan for it not to happen ever, is my encouragement. Did that help, Matthew?
Yes, but I would still like to understand better so is getting a cover crop out there, is that also an important factor? And also you mentioned you've got to have a good decomposition cycle at the end of harvest before it gets too cold. Could you explain that a little more?
I'm not quite sure I understood your first part. Let me address was your first part the cover crop question?
Yes.
So let's talk about the cover crop. The cover crop question is a very good question. A soil that is bare is going backwards. In principle and in general, we would encourage cover crops. We understand there are cases where that actually cannot be done ideally. And that is a compromise that will not help you as good as it would and should. But if you have a cover crop approach and you can put it in, if you have a late harvest, you're really dinked. That's for sure going to go against that. The compromise you cannot make is you cannot have a compromise of not having a good decomposition in the soil. That you cannot do. And get by. To serve the soil, you have to have a good decomposition. I would encourage everyone to have two things in their operation. Every so many years, they should have a livestock integration, and they should be cover cropping as a general rule. But remember, I said the word general rule. I know, I've been around the entire country, that there are cases and times where you can achieve the same goal doing it otherwise, and I get that. I understand that. Resources, you name it, etc. But the principle remains. Early harvest will still help you win further. Did that make sense?
Yes.
So the one thing you cannot think about, or no, I should say differently, the one thing that one compromise that will really bite you and you cannot overcome it, and that is if you do not have time for good decomposition after harvest. You've got to have that principle. The other thing that you cannot have, in my mind, without sacrificing a lot is a late harvest is a soil that has not been restored after pulling away from the soil. The soil needs time to restore. I'm sorry? Do I have someone else inadvertently not muted? I'm not sure. But to answer your point, a soil that you conserve is going to be done with an early harvest and a good decomposition. And let me be blunt. You cannot serve the soil if it's a late harvest and there's not a good decomposition in the fall, because the soil needs to be restored after a crop. I would say even in Southern California, where they're used to having 2 harvests a year on the annual crop side, that this is still true. You still have to somehow get that. It has been said that there needs to be a minimum of 56 days of serving the soil with cover crops or doing some things with a crop that's not necessarily pulling from the soil somehow, some way, every 12-month cycle for you to maintain it. The magic about those words. I wouldn't get hung up on the exact detail, but the bottom line is, the principle is if you serve your soil, the soil will serve you. I just wanted to pull it back into big context. I hope that helped, Matthew.
Yes.
Thank you. Next. Anyone?
Want to take care of it? There's a piece of iron that fell when we put that wood in there.
Okay, no, I don't think we need wood there.
Side.
I'm just kidding.
I'm
just kidding. I think someone is not muted. Okay. Any other questions?
Yeah, another question I have, Matthew, again, is on late termination of a cover crop to get your cash crop planted in the spring. You mentioned mowing.
There have been times where we had no opportunities to terminate a crop by tilling it in the early spring, and in those cases we have been very successful in mowing the cover crop back just to gain some time until the soil became dry enough to then terminate it by working the soil.
So my question is, why does that hinder? Is it just simply as the cover crop matures, you'll have a higher carbon to nitrogen ratio and potentially will tie up nitrogen availability for the cash crop coming along, or why is a late and a mature cover crop a downside?
Okay, so a mature cover crop managed well when in conjunction with a lot of space between terminating a mature crop and planting the new crop still works well. Keep that in mind. But I would like to give you a context of this. If you would put this soil aspect into and kind of make it a person for the moment, not that I want to, but act like the soil can actually talk to us, and it's going to say, now look, I've given my best into this cover crop, and I believe we should be actually feeding our cover crops as much as we feed our annual cash crops, if that's the case, or our trees, if we're doing cover crops in the midst of our trees. I believe we need to feed our cover crops as if it was a cash crop. But the soil then says, okay, that's fine, but give me a chance to get a breath. I need to digest this stuff. I need to focus on getting this taken care of. I need to utilize what I've put into this crop so I can get back out, so I can restore myself, and then I'll be ready to take on another crop. It is not just an anchor for plants. The soil is not just there to be used. It's there to give and to take. And if we take more than we give, we eventually go bankrupt. Maybe not bankrupt financially, but the soil becomes no longer to give much. Do you understand that principle?
Yes. So to your comment about a mature cover crop being terminated, and then that can still work well if there's enough time elapsed before you're planting after that. How much time, if the cover crop is fairly mature, how much decomposition time is needed for that to work well?
Question. Yeah, that's an excellent question, Matthew. How much time does it take? The answer is as variable as every farm, because how healthy is the soil? How vigorously will it digest? What's the process of how it can assimilate, and how fast can it be restored? There's a word out there called resilience. How resilient is your soil? If it's just really poor and not interactive, it takes perhaps twice the time as it does otherwise. There is no cookie cutter answer. Back to your comment about the CN ratio, it robs nitrogen. It does, but that's just a small portion of the bigger picture. It's much better, in my opinion, to say, think about the soil being a living entity, and it's saying, okay, give me a break. Let me restore this. I've done my best for this cover crop. Let me now restore where I'm come from. It's taken a little bit out of me. I'm going to have to restore myself, and then I'll be more than happy to give you my entire focus for your cash crop. Do you understand what I'm saying? I feel that that's more accurate than it is to put it down into just a CN scenario, even though the CN, the carbon to nitrogen ratio, becomes off and it needs to balance itself, and that takes energy and that takes time, and that is an accurate statement that there's nitrogen tie-up. But so is there other nutrient tie-ups. It's not just nitrogen. It's never just one isolated situation. We have to understand the big picture. Unless we do, we cannot succeed. We've got to understand the bigger picture. And that's why I put it into context as a living entity. It truly is saying, please serve me and I'll be happy to serve you. The soil microbes eat first. The plant gets fed last. Never, ever forget that. It is just the way God has designed it. So if we can plan ahead and look into the bigger picture and serve the soil, then it will serve our plants. We recognize, practically speaking, from a pure application point of view, farmers do have to do both at times. There are times where it's just cold and rainy for all the way up until late. And those times we have to be ready to do some things we'd rather not do, make some compromises, but be careful with that. I have a really interesting story, a real live one. Really good friends of mine in northeast Missouri, where they were looking at their clay soils. They had recently moved there. This is about 25, 27 years ago. And he was using my services as one who walked beside him in what he's doing. And we're learning together and we're interacting, especially in the spring. And he knows how important it is. I've emphasized this about never, ever working your soils too wet. Because, again, it's this aspect and this concept about serving the soil so the soil serves you. And so May 4th, he gives me a call on this particular year in 1997. And he says, listen, Edwin, my neighbor is planting corn. Now, and as an aside joke, this is actually a real thing that happened about 4 years ago. The guy told me he's going to do it. This is in the winter, and I looked at him and I said, are you serious? He says, yes, I'm going to do it. I just want to document what happens. So he went out with his planter, and it was still fairly wet. There were dry spots on the soil, not a lot, but it was, let me say, 50% dry spots on the soil. And he went out with his planter, believe it or not, and went through the field about a third of the way with his planter in the ground, his markers down. He pulls up, and then he goes to the shed. pretty soon there was a whole bunch of neighbors around him out there in the fields. And of course, a lot of his neighbors had poor yield that year that planted in poor conditions, but they were trying to beat the other guy, see? And this is a funny, comical story about human nature, but I think it's an important factor to build into this teleclass because it is really about either serving yourself or your peers, or it's serving your soil. Never forget that. And so in the context of this, your question was an excellent one, Matthew. We know it's not a cookie cutter answer, but we do know that your soil has to be served. Did that make sense?
Yes. Yes. I want to put one more piece into this mature cover crop termination decomposition piece. What about animal integration? If you graze that mature cover crop with a high density impact of livestock, how does that factor into this decomposition subject and serving the soil?
Yeah, I would be answering it this way. How we've been treating the cover crops before they grazed it? Have we been putting on a humus and liquid humus extract? Did we grow the cover crop that the livestock integrated as if it was cash crop? If the answer is yes, and then we have a high impact, short duration type of grazing, that is extremely beneficial. I would have to say that makes a huge benefit in this decomposition cycle in restoring the soil. And again, the time lengths will be shortened from that livestock grazing to when I can plant. That's one thing I can tell you. But are we then going back right behind our graze and applying again a liquid humus extract and or both liquid humus extract and a humus compost blend just that way? And then how soon do we go back and plant? Those are all decisions that can be made beneficially or detrimentally, and it needs to be based on that field. I wished I'd have finished that story about this guy that called me May 4th. I asked him to wait because he said that the soil was fairly damp, a half an inch down. He could make balls from a half an inch to 1 inch deep. He could make easily balls with his hands. I said, that's way too wet. Let's stay out. It did not go until June 14th that he got to plant, and his yields of corn were 145 bushel that year. Nothing shabby, but nothing real great. The May 4th neighbor yields were 45 bushel. They were 100 bushels less, planted over a month earlier. Why? Because the neighbor violated some principles of serving the soil. And this is something that needs to go on record, folks. We've got to think about soil as a medium that we serve so it can serve our crops. Well, folks, we are out of time. I wish that would have been more interaction. Please feel free to join us at 11 a.m. next Friday morning for some very lively, interactive time soon after our story is told. Certainly incorporate some more questions about this soil aspect because it's all part of the next teleclass as well. Thank you very much for joining us. Talk to you all later. Have a wonderful weekend and a safe and profitable week next week. Thanks, everyone.